Great. Well, welcome. So, as Eleanor mentioned, I'll be speaking on a combination of discussions of morphology, typology, and general NLP in over 1,000 languages. And it's centrally important to acknowledge my collaborators on this work, in particular postdoctoral fellows Chris Kirov, Garrett Nikolai, Oliver Adams, and John Selleck-Glassman, and PhD students Winston Wu, Ari McCarthy, Patrick Shaw, Ryan Cotterill, and Aaron Mueller, who've contributed the central component of this work, and a number of very talented master students, including Nidhi Voss, John Hewitt, Roger Che, Dylan Lewis, Lawrence Worth-Garkin, James Scarf, and Emily Rose-Gruen, and many more that have contributed along the way to various things. But these are those central ones behind the work I'm presenting today. So, with respect to typology and morphology, there are a couple of different ways we can look at this. One is through the typology of word formation processes, agglutinative languages, fusional processes, and the like. And these are generally well taxonomized, and many of the processes have substantial phonology components as well. So we can look at this component of the box, and there are obviously fascinating questions as to how, in a language like Quechua, you would form the various inflections of the verb wanu chie, I believe, found here. And that is indeed the goal of a lot of traditional morphology and a lot of traditional morphological typology, to understand these variations. However, an interesting and perhaps equally important aspect of morphology and typology is the semantic feature space, these dimensions of meaning, shall we say, that form the axes of these paradigms. So the traditional ones, such as person, number, etc., but also perhaps less commonly attested ones in many languages, such as inclusivity, inclusive or exclusive, we in this case, and a range of course, tenses and other dimensions, including evidentiality. So past tense as experienced and past tense as reported, but not directly observed. So we see in a language like Quechua two major distinctions of meaning, which are not traditionally observed in most Western European or even Indo-European languages in general. And the focus of a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is really on these dimensions of meaning, the dimensions in space of options by which we can reflect information in a language, and whether this is morphologically reflected or through syntax or some other process. And the Unimorph project had as one of its central bases, in fact, I would say even perhaps one of the most important bases, was a universalized taxonomization of these dimensions of meaning. So in work that John Selleck-Glassman and I did when we were coming up with the original schema for Unimorph, we decided to use the Leipzig notation that's sort of the default standard for use in interlinear glossing for morphology and syntax and every other layer that we will see in a traditional gloss text, and taxonomize these as dimensions of meaning for our morphological database. And you see that this goes well beyond the dimensions of traditional person, number, part of speech, tense, and aspect, and polarity, but includes a wide range. So, for example, I mentioned evidentiality. Is this from hearsay or inference or reported speech? Quechua will have direct versus reported, or experience versus reported speech as a distinction made in the morphology. There are affix differences that correspond to evidentiality. Within person, we see, in addition to the major levels of personhood, including the non-traditional ones, such as fourth person. We have exclusivity and inclusivity as additional subdimensions of personhood. And these are not mutually exclusive. You could have, obviously, first person exclusive as a combination of features. Enormous range of politeness, switch reference, valency, very detailed range of voice, whole range of gender systems, including traditional natural or grammatical gender, and as realized in a number of class systems of world languages. Obviously, forms like animacy, axiom, aspect, case in a very rich structure. So we tried to taxonomize many of these dimensions of meaning that are reflected in at least one morphological system on the planet. So this was done by exhaustive research on John's part, where we found what we believe to be those dimensions of meaning that had some surface morphosemantic realization. And there are obviously others that are realized through other layers in a grammatical system, but these were the core of what we wanted to have as the basis of Unimorph. And they have a lot of value for downstream tasks. So if you're trying to do analysis of locationhood, case, deixis are all important to know. Is this a location entity? And obviously, the locative case is helpful for that. Animacy properties in verbs can help distinguish people from non-animate entities. Time and urgency, sentiment, polarity can be captured by mood, interrogative, and polarity. Source information, as I said, evidentiality. Was this reported through a third party, or was this directly observed? And that can have important implications for the credibility of the speaker and the evidence presented. Obviously, semantic role labeling of some sort, interpersonal relationships through politeness. They're all captured via some major aspect of these dimensions of meaning, often in morphology, but often in other layers using the same dimensions of meaning. So syntax can convey semantic roles just as well as case does in some languages. And as you can see, this can become extremely rich. So here's an example from dimensions of meaning from the Swahili or generally Bantu language family, as realized in just the morphology. So these are not dimensions that are realized through other prosodic or syntactic features, but they are a quite rich augmentation of our traditional space. So we have this sort of universalized forms of tense and aspect and conditionality and polarity, positive, negative. And we have some, I would say, plausibly universalized normalizations. Again, this is the raw data. This came from Wiktionary in their inflectional tables, but we've incorporated these into the Unimorph feature space. And many of these additional nuanced dimensions that are realized on the surface morphology in Swahili are things that are at least plausibly universal in terms of the meaning representation. Whether it's done through other layers of the grammar is an open question, but presumably the notion of conditionality contrary to fact, or various perfectivity and tense aspects, conditionality if when, if not, consecutive verbal realizations, a range of relative forms between multiple dependent actions in the past. All these things are potentially extensible to more broad multilingual spaces. Now, obviously, the Bantu language family has its own rich gender system, class system. In this case, the traditional sort of 18 or so Bantu classes, but these, at least some aspect of these, can be universalized in a broadly multilingual way, and then some in a cross-Bantu way. But they do tend to convey meaningful semantic categories that other languages represent in various ways. So our question then is, how many of these and in what way can we learn these dimensions of meaning, and what typological distribution do we have for these meaning dimensions as realized directly in the morphology, directly in the syntax, directly in the prosody, and so forth. So the question I'd like to raise is, one, where is this distinction raised? Sometimes it's in addition to morphology, via affix or word variation, simply different lexicalizations, which often is in the pronominal space. And this is a soft boundary with morphology. If the words are structurally related, including pronominal variations, we often will consider this morphological variants, while tú and usted or tú and vosotros are not traditionally considered a morphological variation, but convey the distinction of formality through different lexical choice. Word order, dependency, prosody, intonation, all can potentially convey aspects of the previous dimension of the meaning, although it's relatively rare to see these captured directly in the prosody intonation. Obviously, certain aspects like stress are well conveyed in the prosodic space, as is interrogativity and the like, but other dimensions tend to be communicable in the written form, which prosody is typically not realized. And the open-ended question is what distinctions are not communicated in the language in any of the above processes? Which distinctions are simply not made or not realizable? These distinctions are realized in WALS, the World Atlas of Linguistic Structures, in the category of nominal categories and verbal categories. There's a good 50 plus of these distinctions that are sort of on the boundary between morphology and syntax, because these distinctions on the dimensions of meaning are realized in many cases in both the morphology and the syntax. So I think in any kind of analysis of morphosemantics, we want to realize which features are captured, but it's an equally important question to ask about syntax and other studies of linguistic structure. So here are a few additional questions I'd like to raise. One, are all the dimensions of meaning that are conveyed via morphology, or are all dimensions of meaning above actually conveyed via at least one language in morphology? And the answer is, via the Leipzig instantiations that we created for Unimorph, the answer is yes, that there was a scholarly investigation that showed all of those showed up in at least some morphological system. Are these dimensions of meaning, they're not conveyed in at least some language? And obviously, if you have languages that are free word order, that gives us some impetus to have most of these dimensions of meaning conveyed morphologically, because the word order, and traditionally the syntax, is therefore limited into perhaps stress or emphasis, but often does not well serve the rendering of some of these other dimensions that we see before. So most of those that are captured in a language like Latin, for example, will be in the morphological system, just because the the free order limits the extent to which syntax can convey these robustly. Do languages all have equal commutative power and efficacy and potential? And that's obviously a sensitive question. There's this sort of presumption that all languages of the world are equally powerful, valid, complete. And if you give two people in various language pairs a task, monolingually, they can, in theory, complete that task with roughly equal efficacy within their language. Now, a lot of indication is that this is not true, that there are distinctions that are made in some languages that are simply not made in others, in any of the layers, morphology, syntax, prosody. There's just some indication that these are distinctions that are not made overtly. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible to convey the information, but it typically takes additional lexical exposition, and it's not information that is conveyed in the core grammar of the language. It's essentially something that has to be added on, often overtly, and often missed. So there are languages out there that have positional systems that are not based on traditional axes of laterality or distance, but by absolute coordinates, north, south, east, and west, and every kind of motion is oriented to these absolute renderings. And it's obviously not the case that every language is communicating in a traditional motion verb, the direction that's traveled or otherwise referenced simply in the grammar of the language. Now, it's not to say you can't mention, I drove north, or I threw the ball north, but for the most part, that is information that is not captured and not rendered. Other distinctions are simply untranslatable, not communicable in many languages without even more intense exposition and clauses that would provide that definition through exposition. Are all the written forms of a language equally commutative in their power, efficacy, and potential? And this is essentially saying, is there anything that's in prosody that would be lost in the written form? Or do we, can the written forms be equally adequate in terms of the information they convey? And then finally, sort of what information is indeed conveyed overtly in language X, either in writing or in speech, that is not conveyed overtly in another language. And or these questions are going to be my focus for the remainder of the talk. Now, before I get to that point, I would like to give a plug for Unimorph. I mentioned it already, and it started out not only being a robust, normalized, universalized database with a common schema, but it was critically important that we normalized all the dimensions of meaning down to the feature structure, because you'll see enormous variation. A Spanish data set will mention the preterite, while another one will mention the past perfective, and they're effectively equivalent. We want to normalize that with Leipzig standards and not just use the native canonical terminology. We've tried to universalize case systems of the world. That is more challenging, but we are informed greatly by our friends in Finland and elsewhere with exceptionally rich case structure. But ultimately it comes down to this database of four tuples of language, lemma, inflection, and this Leipzig-based universalized feature structure. And these features are never redundant between dimensions of meaning, so you can have these in any order, and unlike the traditional UD or Prague standards, the meanings are not position dependent in the feature structure. You can put tense and person and number anywhere you want. We have remarkably good and increasing coverage. This is from quite a few years ago, but we're well over 100 languages and growing, and we actively encourage your contribution if you're interested in helping universalize the data set. In addition, we at Johns Hopkins have added some additional columns beyond the inflection, root, and Leipzig feature vector. We have realized these templatic structures that essentially correspond to the generic glossing of these feature structures. So this is essentially how would you render this particular feature structure into a language like English. And the nice thing about this is that if you're starting from an arbitrary foreign language, as long as you can translate the lemma into English, like eat, you can use these templatic structures to convey not only the feature vector, but a reasonable gloss into English of these features. Not only generically, I was being, or they will not have been being, and so forth, but the actual, I was eating, they will not have been eating, and so forth. So that's an additional contribution to the unimorph schema that's in progress. We've also made extensions to the unimorph schema that's focused on looking at segmentation. So, for example, in Oromo in Spanish, it's not just the case that we want to have the raw features without some sort of correlation with the surface morphemes as is realized in a segmentation framework, but actually making an effort at doing that segmentation. Now, it's obviously something that's a sensitive question, a theory-dependent question, exactly where these boundaries are. It's something that we try to keep as a parallel structure to allow for the fact that where you form the segment boundaries is much more subjective than the presence or absence of one of these morphological features. Another useful thing that we try to do is render both the surface segmentation and the canonical segmentation. So not only do you have Duermen as realized, present third person singular, indicative and so forth as the feature space, but we want to distinguish both the segmentation of Duerm and then N and the canonical segmentation of Dornmir and N. Or even potentially canonicalize the affixes into equivalence classes for the different paradigms. All of these are potentially useful additions that can and do co-occur in parallel and coexist in parallel. We've also extended this to derivational morphology. And that's a different talk, but for example, the generic affix ness and iti both essentially convey a normalization that represents stativity. Their ness and iti have obviously different etymological bases, but the semantics tend to be functionally equivalent. So by normalizing these as stative and also rendering the attested affix, we sort of get the best of both worlds. So Ryan Cotterill has done some very nice work rendering canonicalized morphology using an affix system, and we are essentially combining these things into multiple demonymic affixes, so nominalizations that are of a person from X, Canadian, Burmese, Brisbaneite, Michigander, and so forth, by normalizing both their semantics and the affixes as well. And you can do that through the inflectional space as well. You can easily have a traditional unimorph Leipzig basis and then the segmented affix. And here you basically get the best of all worlds. No information is lost. If you all you care about is the feature space, you can use that. If you care about the attested affix, you can derive the segmentation or have the additional nuance, because maybe you argue that actually the affix and S and IT are not simply semantically equivalent renderings of stativity normalization, but there's some nuance. So these are essentially a language dependent subsense of that generic form. And one thing that's central to all of these in the derivational space is the notion that part of speech transduction, adjective noun normalizations, verbal normalization, noun normalizations, and so forth, the part of speech transduction is something that we see cross-linguistically as well-attested, fairly robust universal feature. And because of that, and also with the much higher inter-annotator agreement rate. So because of that, we tend to make these the central annotation component. This is essentially a nominalization or nominalization from an adjective, with stativity being one component of that, and the stativity as realized by Ness as being a subcomponent of that. Okay, so again, there's a lot of richness here. Finally, I wanted to render this notion of how we can use these glosses. So if you have a morphological analysis that is rendered from a Turkic language like Basturgan, rendered as Basturmak, plus a universalized feature space, we can render this particular positive, perfective, present, first person singular as I have past participle. And if we then know that Basturmak is translated as to crush or to crush a rebellion, we can then come up with a gloss, I have crushed or I've crushed a rebellion, just by the dictionary and the morphological feature space. The glossing and ultimately the translation come as a kind of a free ride. These also have values in machine translation. Part of the thing we've been trying to do in the unimorph space is to show value for information extraction, for MT and the like. And I'm not claiming that these outperform BPE by pair encoding or other sort of techniques of subword handling in MT, but we do see that morphologically informed segmentation, such as in this case Kinyarwanda, will have value not only for segmenting the input stream, but also generating word-based glosses that have a basis in the morphological feature plus the lemma translation, so bomb or arm or so forth, plus the feature space can give you a reasonably robust gloss, which helps in both MT and other information extraction applications. So in terms of data sources, I'd like to explore that in a bit more depth. So part of the title of the talk had to do with sort of biblical or Bible-based typology, morphology, and NLP. And I don't want to be particularly narrow to the Judeo-Christian tradition, in terms of the Bible, there are many other religious texts that, for a number of reasons, are, of course, translated widely. Dianetics, whether you consider it science fiction or religion, has been translated into 64 languages. Harry Potter, 73, including the only monograph-like treatment of a book in ancient Greek in the last 1,000+ years. As we see here, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is about 503 languages. Unfortunately, it's only 1,700 words long. The Book of Mormon, particularly promising for a number of reasons. First of all, it's translated into somewhere on the order of 100 to 120 languages, depending upon whether it's online or only in printed form, and has to be then OCR'd, which has some issues. It's also only about 200,000 words long. But one of the pluses of it is that it covers a lot of languages that we don't have a Bible for. So Truckese is a language spoken in a tiny South Pacific island, but the Book of Mormon has been translated into quite a few South Pacific languages, given an emphasis on evangelization in these communities. So the Bible. So the Bible has been translated in at least full New Testament form in about 1,700 languages. We have smaller segments in many more, and we have the Lord's Prayer and a few other things in more than that. But it is the most wide-scale, multilingual parallel text that we have and are almost certainly going to have for a very long time. The Old and New Testament together on the order of 300,000 words. The New Testament by itself is around 100 or so thousand words. And this is all equivalent to about 20 hours of speech in most renderings. So it's substantial enough to convey things. And one of the nice things about it, of course, is that it has a remarkable range of these dimensions of meaning. So the Bible is to the wilderness data set from CMU, developed by Alan Black. We do have 600 spoken versions that could help us with some of the other languages of meaning, dimensions of meaning, like prosodic ones or those that are conveyed in intonational and other surface forms. It's broadly available intensively in certain languages. There are 23 separate varieties of just Zapotec with New Testament Bible translations. So that's also useful for dialect studies and typological studies across dialects. So one of the advantages of the Book of Mormon is that it is carefully sentence aligned and labeled by chapter and verse, which is true for the Bible as well. But what's not true for the Bible is that there's a common translation source for the Book of Mormon. Traditionally, the Mormon religion, the Book of Mormon was translated by Joseph Smith from golden plates. Those are no longer available to us, but this essentially funnels everything in terms of all the translations into the 120 or so languages via a single source text. So we don't go directly from the golden plates into Quechua. We go entirely via the English reference text. So now we have a cleaner form of bitext, in that we don't really need to worry about where the source was. It's clearly from the English, and everything is translated from this sort of divinely inspired standard. Now, the Bible has no such luxury. Just for example, the Old Testament will have a very complicated translation history where you might, a given English source or Navajo source might be directly translated from the Hebrew or via Greek translation of the Hebrew or a Latin translation of the Greek or the Hebrew, or and so forth. And a language like Navajo might come from English, might come from Spanish. Unlikely the Navajo translators will go directly back to the Latin or Greek source. They might in some cases if there's an open question, as I'll get to, but in terms of the semantics, but the in general, as we get to the more remote languages that don't have translation resources and theological resources, they tend to use some standard interlingua forms, such as the King James Version or whatever was preferred by that particular Bible translation framework. And unfortunately, it's not just one of these things. Sometimes we have 27 English Bibles that we use in our studies, and I suspect that translators into Navajo will be using the group of these 27 for their inspiration, as well as Spanish and other Amerindian languages as well. So people can rely on many different sources, but this complicates obviously the development of BITEX, because we're not quite sure what the translation is of, and that could essentially shift into verse, and there may not even be a single source for any given verse, let alone the entire Bible itself. Although for some of the Protestant translations into a lot of evangelical countries, there are a few Bibles like the King James Version that are central. Sort of the origin for most of the translation. Now, this is very helpful for paraphrase and dialect variation studies within not just English, but other languages. So you can align all these. We have aligned all these, and you can see the enormous range of, in just English, variation in terms of how a single verse is realized at the deep semantic level, either semantic distinctions like said or answered or replied, or garden, orchard, paradise, and so forth. And there are obviously some theological and practical distinctions here, but there are also these that involve morphosemantics too. Now, how do we use this? Well, we can take our, for example, multiple English Bibles and align them to each other. So we have called and sent and summoned, the astrologers, the magi, the wise men. And there will be information that's reordered, information that's added or lost in some of these translations. But at least the semantic content we believe to be consistent. We can then align one or many of these into other languages like Spanish. We can annotate them with part of speech, semantic role, dependency, whatever feature space you would like, and then project those onto the foreign language. And this is a work that which was fantastic. Grace and I developed back in 2001, where we were, I believe, the first to sort of pioneer this paradigm of translingual information projection annotations across word-aligned bytext, and then training monolingual analyzers for those features on the other side. And notice, of course, that when you project annotations, you're not necessarily annotating something that's distinguished in the target language. So national laws, we know from English that this is a plural set of laws. There's more than one law in question here. In Chinese, that distinction is not made, but we can still annotate this as more than one law, plural law, by virtue of the presence in English. Now, we don't by any means make English the font of all knowledge. There are a lot of other features in terms of case and formality and evidentiality and inclusivity and the like that are well rendered by other languages, and then we can project those back onto English or to an interlingual Bible that we're developing. But The idea is that these the Bibles serve as a vehicle for projection of features. So how do we use this for typological studies? So before I answer that question, let me just observe that biblical translators have some advantages. They're clearly motivated to convey all of the information in the original Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and so forth, so that no religious information or distinctions are lost. They're obviously, they don't want to, if you believe this is divinely inspired, you don't want to lose some of this divine inspiration and divine content. If you believe it's not, I mean, obviously, if someone's translating Harry Potter, you want to be faithful to J.K. Rowling. It was her work, but translators will take liberties in terms of the exact content for making literature, making rhyme, something that is a desirable trade book. It's not absolutely essential that you be completely faithful to every nuance of Rowling's original work, but in the Bible, that's not the case. We really need to be faithful to the source, although which source is another question. There's typically no other footnotes or other expositional space available. Translations are typically one verse long, and some modern English Bibles will read more like a retelling of a story, often with explicit morals or explanations for children, for example. But for the most part, the 5,000 or so Bibles that are potentially out there, and the 700 or so that we've analyzed, virtually all of them are just translations of the verses from the formal rendering. Bible translators in general do not insert meaning distinctions that are made in the original text. They're not made in the original text. There's danger in that. The translator would be adding his or her own theological interpretations that were not supported somewhere, either by the original Hebrew or Greek or so forth, or by some respected commentary. If there's a distinction, as we'll see coming up, that's important to make in some languages, and it's not rendered in Hebrew or Greek, that's very dangerous territory, because you're making assumptions about the theological semantics which aren't in the original source. Is that a well-informed choice? And finally, these religious information that are conveyed are typically done so entirely in the writing system. I know, obviously, Hebrew specifically has a long oral tradition, but for the most part, from some point going forward, most religious texts are written because oral transmission is unreliable and subject to canon loss, a human memory, or creative variation, and so forth. So you're kind of limited by those dimensions of meaning that can be captured in the writing system. So let's look at some examples. So let's take formality. So it turns out that the Greek renders a distinction between the informal and formal for both pronouns and also the inflectional system. And this is an example of the pronoun space, but we can basically do correlation analysis and discover that indeed Spanish has annotations that correlate well with the Greek formality distinctions. So if you knew nothing about Spanish, you would conclude that indeed there is a formality distinction. Pre-modern English likewise has that, thou versus you, based on the correlation with the Greek forms. Current English does not. I mean, you'll see thou occasionally, but for the most part, everything's rendered as you. Now, one thing I was surprised at when I first looked at this data was that when humans in the Bible communicate with God, they use the informal rather than the formal. You say, I shall not fear, for thou art with me, the informal form. And this is not a modern theological innovation. This was observable in the biblical Greek. It's not a distinction that some innovator or some translator decided to make in a language that has to make that distinction. And in general, subsequent translations have been faithful to that distinction. Not all, unfortunately. So the Japanese translation that we looked at does not use the informal to speak with God for perhaps sensibility reasons, or just it would not be what you would use to communicate with the deity in Japan. So they override that clue from the Greek. But regardless, we can analyze the Greek form or one of our other languages to not just have this pronoun labeled as a raw word, but by its semantic feature. And then we can identify languages like Spanish or modern English that make this distinction in the pronominal system and those that do not. And of course, we can apply the same techniques for correlating affixes with either specific forms or through the generic unomorph style, Leipzig style distinctions. So we can say that in both the morphology and the pronominal system, Spanish and pre-modern English have formality distinctions, while current English does not. Inclusivity is another problem. So I assume most of you know, but obviously inclusivity is a rich system. The Walls has two categories for inclusivity in both independent pronouns and the verbal inflectional system. But they're not quite as comprehensive as you might actually observe. There are at least 6 major possibilities of inclusivity in terms of the first person plural, I and you and nobody else, I and someone else but not you, I and someone else but also you, I and definitely you and possibly someone else, this is underspecified, and then the English form, which is I and either you or somebody else, and it's ambiguous which. So if I say to my kids, we're going out for dinner tonight, they don't know is that my wife and I are going out for dinner tonight or they're included. That's and for people in languages like Quechua and Tagalog, where this is centrally made, there is no generic we. They just almost can't conceive of how you can communicate in English without this important distinction being made. And my kids might agree with them. But we have this distinction in Quechua. I showed you that in the beginning of the talk. And then the question is, if we have to translate the Bible into Quechua, how do we do it? Because neither the Latin nor the Greek nor the Hebrew have that distinction. The King James Version, if you take that as sort of divinely inspired, has no such distinction. We are dependent upon somebody in that translation space deciding, about, we will inherit the riches of heaven. Who's referenced in that we? Is that, the elect and me, or are you included in that? That's ambiguous, and that's a problem. Something we haven't said yet, but I'd like to, is to see to what extent is these features rendered consistently in different translations. Or is there theological consensus on these dimensions of meaning that are present overtly in some languages and not others? That's knowing which pronoun and which inflectional system or both to use in Quechua is obligatory. We have to make that distinction, and we occurs many thousands of times in the Bible. Which one is it? Another distinction that is, I think, relevant typologically is that of lexical semantics as well. So I know this is not traditional typology, but if you have a space of sub-sentences like kill, cost to die, we can taxonomize these into various feature distinctions: human versus animal killing, intentional versus unintentional, legal, illegal, punishment not as punishment, and self-defense not as self-defense, and so forth. And English has some of these distinctions. I mean, we distinguish slaughter as typically animal killing, murder is illegal killing, execution is punishment killing. But we often do not make this distinction. There's a generic kill, and different languages will, some languages have no generic kill that is shared between animals and humans. It's entirely distinct. There's no one word that handles both, no hypernym. And this is a problem for like the sixth commandment. It turns out in Hebrew is actually rendered something that's closer to thou shalt not murder. It's actually it's implying this sort of intentional illegal killing. Well, somewhere in the translate pipeline into English, that was lost. Thou shalt not kill is there was no such pacifist, all life is sacred kind of attitude in the Bible. It was a very specific subsense of killing that was lost. So the Bible is limited in its ability to handle these things. But I would encourage us in the typology space to consider the typological partitionings of lexical semantics. Now, Walls does this to some extent. If you look in the Bible, in Walls, there are systematic lexicon features that are included, like the hand, arm, foot, leg distinction, are lexicosemantic differences that are taxonomized in Walls as typological systems. But we could do the same thing for the, is there a difference between human-animal killing in our lexicon or not? So we don't have to stop for things that are directly in the morphosyntax. So let's kind of finish up by looking at a couple of quick experiments here. I realize I've been running a bit long, but let's go into one of these. So we have one of the things that we've done is aligned our Bibles with a focus on name entities. So there are about 700 or so names that we looked at with multiple renditions, and we carefully populated these in a database with not only their dominant translation, but all the variants. So this is the dominant form, but there are many others due to inflection and so forth, and error. And one of the things we can actually do is come up with some common forms that are typically shared in a partition of the space into equivalence classes. So for example, Egypt will have Egypto, Isip, Messir, Egypt, Ehip, and so forth. And obviously there's a lot of the countries with Arabic influences will use some variant of Messir and so forth. But if we're trying to do alignment, it's helpful to have these sort of interlingual anchor points as well. And you can see a lot of nuance across these things. You also see some errors. So you'll see, for example, I'll show you in a second. Here's Egypt, and this is sorted into a tree structure sort based on ethnolog, and you'll clearly see sort of the regions of the Messir space and things that are obviously translated originally from English or French or Spanish. And these dwarf what, for example, Wikipedia or Wiktionary will give for translations in English. The fact that we have 700 plus in that initial study, which has grown substantially since then, compared to 55, is impressive. There's issues in terms of the projection noise. And the most interesting one of these is inflection. Now, obviously, there are just long errors. So David in some text is aligned to Melech, which means king. That's not the translation. Although king and David often go closely together. But we can enumerate all of the candidates that a given word is aligned to, including Melech, and then try to learn the some rendering of the lemma. First of all, recognizing that there's a lemma, and then rendering. So here are these major variants. Here's some target candidates that we observe in the data set. So in a particular source, we have Ferrot, which is just current error. Some of these are low Levenstein confusable. Epot and in Egypt look fairly close on the English level, but actually the correct translation is close, has low Levenstein with the ESEP major variant. So these forms help. We would like to be able to figure these out, and we can model phonological changes fairly nicely between languages. So we see JFS distinction, PF distinction, D, T distinction, and so forth. So these are helping us build translators that go fairly robustly beyond just the biblical words, because a lot of names in the Bible are names that occur in modern usage as well. You can often learn those sound shifts. Now, from a morphological perspective, part of our goal here is to find both the lemma, the consensus form, this debito, and it's not always the most dominant. In fact, in this case, it's not the most common. One of the inflections, this is a language that has inflections on proper names as well. A particular form that's not the citation form is the dominance. So we'd like to analyze this and also learn the morphology along the way. And we can essentially hypothesize transductions between an observed form and a hypothesized a citation form. So we can hypothesize debito or any of these other ones as a potential citation form, and essentially use minimum description length to realize that this is actually a more efficient rendering of a citation form and transductions. And we can globally optimize this to find the most likely canonical form and the affixes. And then the question is, how do we correlate them? And this ties back to the morphological system, because the correlation can be on any number of one of these levels. It could be a syntactic, it could be a word choice, it could be an affix choice, prefix, suffix, predict, and so forth. And one of the nice things about this is that this database that I mentioned before of names has not just the standard citation form, but it also has the possessive Egypt, the demonymic Egyptian, and the plural demonymic. So English does make these distinctions. And that gives us a substantial basis on which we can learn these distinctions. So here's some examples where we have the genitive or the possessive form. Christ, Christ, Moses, Moses's. In Spanish, it's rendered syntactically with a preposition of de Cristo, de Moises. The demonymic and the plural are rendered cleanly. French, it's eclitic, de Hérode, and so forth, that renders the genitive. Turkish has all three rendered as affixes, although in this case, the demonym and demonymic plural show clear signs of agglutinative behavior. So by doing this analysis just on our names, we can see the question of, okay, typologically, given the dimension and meaning of the possessive or genitive, the demonymic, the plural, and then others, what are indeed these renderings that are observed? We can use this for translation once we've learned these systems to get a reasonable translation matrix. out of this. So once we learn how to essentially come up with a demonymic plural, we can apply those patterns to other names fairly robustly. Likewise, we can learn the analysis system by projecting both the singular and the demonymic plural via bytext, and then saying, okay, these have a particular demonymic plural relationship, so we assume that Messier and Messier Lilar also has that same relationship, so let's learn what that is. And that could be, again, that could be an affix, it could be acclitic, it could be a word order choice, it could be a preposition. Any of these things are potentially things that correspond to these features. And we would like to learn typologically what in these X thousand languages rendered. Now you might say, oh, well, we have this. Walls has told us all we need to know. But I tried to motivate before that indeed for many of these distinctions that we might care about, Walls hasn't yet covered them. And we don't want to limit ourselves to what Walls has covered. We can model the distribution of these things statistically. We can apply these as morphological generators. We can learn canonicalized forms of the genitive, sound shifts that are canonical, prefixes, separate words, and so forth. But ultimately, it comes down to this, and I'll end on this slide, which is we can take the distribution that we see, and this is just 3 particular typological features. Or I should say, forgive me, dimensions of meaning. Let me be clear about this. So this is the genitive or the possessive form of the names. And we observe that in the Celtic languages, they're virtually never rendered via morphology, via the affixation. Likewise, for Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian, and the Romance languages, they tend to not be rendered the possessive as a morphological. It's always de or de and so forth. Mayan, Igbo. So, and we find that across language families, this is robustly rendered. While in other language families, so the Turkic families, the Slavic families, some of these Amerindian families, you'll have high realization rates through morphology and affixation. The demonymic, you'll have different distributions. So, for example, the Celtic languages do have affixal renderings with reasonably high coverage of the demonym form, while Spanish is somewhere between, or the Romance languages, on average about a quarter of the time they do. So there's some demonymic forms, but you'll also see, in terms of affixation, but you'll also see forms that are using de or de or other lexical or syntactic forms. The Mayan and Igbo based families have no such inflectional forms as well, and we can essentially use this kind of data not just for these 3 particular forms that I've shown, but pretty much for any feature. So I tried to motivate things like lexical variation in kill and inclusivity and the like as things that may or may not be included in walls, but are eminently learnable at an individual language basis and at a language family basis. And obviously there's noise in this. These are not 1.0 for these distributions, but there's enough signal here to give us a clue as to what are the preferred ways of rendering things. And indeed, some are free variation. I mean, you could have the possessive in English also rendered as of a certain percentage of the time. So that's why these, even for languages in the Slavic family, where it's strongly preferred to have a morphological affixal feature for this possessive or genitive feature, it's not ubiquitous. So I would like to end with that thought, which is these walls features or typological features really shouldn't be considered to be strictly Boolean. Many of these things are a tendency. There are multiple options available to us. Obviously, we can talk about having the presence or absence of X dimension and meaning that's rendered in the morphology or the syntax and so forth. But the fact that it's attested does not necessarily mean that it is dominant. It does not mean that it is a particular, either universally observed or partially observed or occasionally observed. So these percentages matter, and I would encourage us typologically to try to have a probabilistic walls, essentially saying, okay, yes, X distinction is made, but how often is it actually used in the morphology layer or in the syntactic layer or in the prosodic layer? Where is that actually communicated? By what means is it communicated? There's a lot of probabilistic rendering that can and should go on here. It's not something that we want to limit ourselves to being just Boolean, because for a lot of practical purposes, if I want to know how to render X dimension and meaning into language Y, I want to know how likely is it to be in language layer X versus language layer Y, how often is it going to be in the morphology to begin with, and then what is the probabilistic distribution over potential realizations of that? What are the affix distributions that are preferred? What are the conditional aspects on these preferences? All that can and should go into an enriched model of our probabilistic walls extensions. So I don't have time to really go into some other things I had hoped to discuss, but let me end there, and delighted to take any questions on some of the more open research questions I raised. Thank you.